All right, we're going to continue with our story on Abraham Lincoln, but first let's review our words again. Stark, stack, stamp, speak, sport, spoke, strap, strong, strand, splash, spleen, splint. All right. Okay, the next word we have is motivate. And motivate is something that makes you want to work all the harder. Like we might use a dog treat to motivate our dog to do a trick, or sometimes hopefully when you get good grades on your spelling test, that will motivate you to work harder again and to keep doing it. So let's find out what might motivate Abe in this chapter. So again, we're going to continue with our biography of Abe Lincoln by Augustus Stevenson. This chapter is called The Preacher Comes. It was late in the afternoon, but Abe was still working in the forest. He was chopping down trees, and he had been working all day. He was tired and wanted to stop. He looked at the sun. No, he couldn't stop yet. The sun was still above the treetops. Abe could tell time by the sun as well as anyone else could by a clock. Now Abe was alone in the woods. He might have stopped work, but there was no one to see and no one to tell. But Abe was honest, and he kept right on chopping. Abe, Abe, someone called. Here I am, called Abe. A minute later, his sister Sarah came down the path. Abe, she said, guess who has come? I can't guess, said Abe. Who is it? It's the preacher, Sarah said. He's going to stay for supper and all night. Now, I can make a connection here. In my house, sometimes we invite the minister from church to come to dinner and eat with us, so I think the Lincolns must have invited the preacher to come eat with them. I'm glad, said Abe. I like to hear him talk, but I can't stop work for an hour or so. Father said that you should stop now, said Sarah. Stop now, said Abe. I can't understand why I should stop early. I can't either, said Sarah, but that's what Father said. He wants you to come home right away. And Mother said you should wash before you come into the cabin. I always do, don't I? Sometimes you forget, Abe. Maybe I do sometimes. Then Abe swung his axe over his shoulder and went home with Sarah. He washed extra well. He combed his hair extra well. Then he went into the cabin. So I think he's motivated to look nice because the preacher is there. Here is Abe, said Mrs. Lincoln, but she didn't smile. The preacher has something to say to you, Abe, said Mr. Lincoln, and he didn't smile. Good evening, Abe, said the preacher, and he didn't smile either. Uh-oh. Abe couldn't understand. The preacher had always joked and laughed with him before. Pastor, said Mr. Lincoln, tell Abe just why you came. The preacher looked at Abe. Abe, he said, I heard that you had been making fun of me. You preached and you made the boys laugh. Oh, yes, said Abe. You coughed just as I do, said the preacher, and the boys laughed at that. Oh, yes, said poor Abe again. And you stood as I do, one leg out, the other leg in, didn't you? Yes, sir, said Abe. And worst of all, you blew your nose as I do, didn't you? Yes, sir, said Abe. But I really wasn't making fun of you, sir. I was just trying to preach. That was it, said Mrs. Lincoln. Abe wanted to preach, and so, of course, he tried to copy you. He didn't know any other way. Sarah, you're always making excuses for Abe, said Mr. Lincoln. You laughed at Abe's preaching yourself, Thomas, said Mrs. Lincoln. Thomas didn't know what to say to that. So he said, never mind, we won't talk about that. Then he turned to the preacher and said, Pastor, I'm going to whip Abe for making fun of you. Thomas, said Mrs. Lincoln, don't whip Abe. He didn't know he was doing wrong. Mr. Lincoln didn't answer her. He took a leather strap from a peg. Abe, he said, go out in the yard. Abe crossed to the door. Mr. Lincoln followed him. Suddenly, a strong hand seized Mr. Lincoln's arm and took the leather strap. Don't touch the boy, said the preacher. I was only joking. I thought you knew that. Abe was really helping me when he tried to preach for the other boys. Helping you, said Mr. Lincoln. I don't understand. Why, said the preacher. Every one of those boys came to meeting last Sunday. They went just to make fun of you, said Mr. Lincoln. Of course, said the preacher, but they stayed, and some of them joined the church. I never held such a meeting. It was splendid. Well, said Mr. Lincoln, I'm surprised to hear that. I'm not surprised, said Mrs. Lincoln. Abe didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. The preacher put his arm around Abe. My boy, he said, Just go on preaching. Your jokes will do a lot of good in the world. And that's where we're going to stop for today.